As the golden hues of the setting sun bathed the small suburban town of Brooksville, Florida, James Porter, a 45-year-old legal consultant, was heading home after a demanding day at work. The hum of his hybrid sedan was barely audible, and the gentle strains of classical music played in the background. The soft whoosh of the air conditioning offered relief from the lingering heat of a late summer evening. As James approached a traffic light near a quiet intersection, he eased up on the accelerator, slowing to a stop just as the light turned red. Suddenly, the familiar strobe of red and blue lights illuminated his rearview mirror, accompanied by the piercing sound of a siren. James sighed, his brow furrowing slightly, and pulled his car over to the side of the road. With a calm demeanor, he rolled down his window and waited as the police cruiser parked behind him. Out stepped Officer Brian Walker, a man in his early 30s with a buzz cut and a rigid stance that exuded confidence. Or perhaps arrogance. Adjusting his belt, he approached James's car with deliberate steps. "License and registration," Walker barked, his voice sharp and authoritative. James nodded silently, retrieving the requested documents from his glove compartment. His movements were steady and calm, though he couldn't ignore Walker's piercing gaze, scanning him as if searching for something to confirm an unspoken suspicion. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Walker asked, leaning slightly into the window. "I'm not entirely sure," James replied evenly, his tone polite but firm. "You didn't come to a full stop at the light." James frowned briefly before nodding. "I thought I slowed down enough, but I understand." Walker lingered by the car, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized James. It was clear this had moved beyond a routine stop in Walker's mind. His posture shifted, and his gaze hardened, as though he'd already decided there was more to uncover. "You're not from around here, are you?" Walker asked, glancing at the license in his hand. "I moved here a few months ago," James replied, keeping his tone neutral. "My address is current on my license." Walker ignored the clarification, leaning closer. "Where are you headed in such a hurry?" "Just going home," James said, maintaining his composure. Walker's demeanor grew colder, his posture stiffening. He studied James with the intensity of someone trying to piece together a narrative. "Step out of the car for me," Walker ordered, his tone clipped. James hesitated, gripping the steering wheel for a moment before releasing it. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" "You want to do this the hard way?" Walker countered, his voice rising slightly. James sighed quietly and stepped out of the car. At 6 feet tall and dressed in a crisp white shirt and tailored slacks, James stood with quiet confidence. His professional demeanor didn't waver, but Walker's narrowed eyes signaled he saw James's composure as defiance. "Hands on the hood," Walker barked. James complied, his movements deliberate. Walker conducted a rough pat down, his hands lingering longer than necessary. It wasn't just a search, it was an attempt to assert control. "You're clean," Walker muttered, stepping back begrudgingly. "Of course I am," James said calmly. "Now, officer, may I ask why this interaction has escalated to this level?" Walker smirked faintly, trying to regain control of the situation. "You seem awfully confident, like you know more than you should. What are you, a lawyer or something?" "Something like that," James replied, his tone unshaken. The silence between them grew heavy, but Walker's attempt to provoke James fell flat. "I think it's time you know who I am," James said, reaching into his pocket slowly. Walker's hand instinctively hovered near his holster. "I'm retrieving my badge," James clarified, his movements deliberate. He held out a leather case and flipped it open. The gleaming badge inside bore his title, James Porter, Director of Oversight, Florida Department of Law Enforcement. Walker froze, his face paling as the weight of the moment sank in. James's voice remained calm. "Respect isn't optional, Officer Walker. It's a fundamental part of the badge you wear. We'll be discussing this further." Without waiting for a response, James stepped back into his car and drove off, leaving Walker standing in the fading light, his confidence shattered and his career hanging by a thread. For James, this was more than a traffic stop. It was a reminder of the work that remained to restore integrity in law enforcement, a responsibility he was determined to uphold. James Porter remained still, his breathing steady, his face calm, as Brian Walker's hands moved deliberately, lingering longer than necessary. It wasn't just a search, it was an attempt to assert dominance rather than serve any practical purpose. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the rustle of fabric and the faint sound of passing traffic in the distance. "You're clean," Walker muttered, stepping back as though reluctant to admit there was nothing to find. "Of course I am," James replied evenly, turning to face Walker, his calmness unwavering. "Now, officer, are we done here, or is there something else you'd like to accuse me of?" Walker bristled at the pointed question, his jaw tightening. "What's your attitude?" he snapped, though his voice carried less authority than before. James' eyes locked onto Walker's, unblinking and sharp. "Attitude? No, officer. What you're sensing is clarity. I'm simply asking for the respect I'm entitled to as a citizen." For a moment, Walker faltered. He glanced down at the badge clipped to his chest, as though trying to remind himself of his authority. But something about James's composed demeanor made it difficult to assert that power the way he was used to. Walker's frustration bubbled over. "You act like you've got all the answers. Who are you, really?" James's lips curved into a faint smile, but there was no warmth in it. Only the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where he stood. He reached into his pocket slowly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. "I'm going to show you my identification," James said, his tone measured, "and I suggest you take a close look." Walker's hand instinctively hovered near his holster, a reflex born of uncertainty rather than necessity. James pulled out a slim wallet, flipping it open to reveal a badge that gleamed under the fading sunlight. "My name is James Porter," he said calmly, holding the badge where Walker could see it clearly. "Director of Civil Oversight, State of Florida. My job is to investigate misconduct within law enforcement and ensure accountability." Walker's face paled, the blood draining from his cheeks as the weight of James' words settled over him. His gaze darted between the badge and James's face, searching for any sign that this was a joke. "This interaction will be documented," James continued, his voice steady but carrying an edge of finality. "Your actions, your tone, and your intentions, everything. This isn't just about me, it's about every person who comes into contact with an officer like you and walks away feeling less safe than they should." Walker swallowed hard, his bravado crumbling under the scrutiny. I didn't realize." "No, you didn't," James interrupted, his voice calm but unyielding. "And that's the problem. You didn't care to realize. You made assumptions based on nothing but bias, and you acted on them without hesitation." The silence that followed was deafening. Walker shifted on his feet, his eyes fixed on the ground. For the first time, he seemed to grasp the gravity of his actions, or at least the consequences that might follow. James stepped closer, his voice dropping just enough to make the words feel personal. "Respect isn't a privilege reserved for a select few. It's a basic expectation. You wear that badge to serve and protect, not to judge and demean." Walker nodded stiffly, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Now," James said, stepping back and motioning to his car, "return my documents and let me be on my way. And when you walk away from this interaction, I suggest you think long and hard about the responsibility that comes with your uniform." Walker fumbled with James's license and registration, his hands trembling slightly as he handed them back. James took the documents, tucked them into his wallet and opened his car door. Before sliding inside, he turned to Walker one last time. "This isn't the end of this conversation, Officer Walker. You'll be hearing from my office soon." As James drove away, Walker stood frozen in place, the red and blue lights of his cruiser still flashing in the growing dusk. For James, this encounter wasn't just another moment of profiling. It was a call to action, a reminder of why he had chosen this career in the first place. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but it would happen, and as James' car disappeared down the quiet street, one thing was certain. Walker's career, like the culture he represented, was about to face a reckoning. "Internal affairs," Walker repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. The weight of those two words seemed to drain the last remnants of his earlier bravado. He stared at the badge as though it had grown teeth, his mind racing to grasp the implications. "Yes, Officer Walker," James said, his voice steady and firm. "Internal affairs. My job is to investigate misconduct within law enforcement, and unfortunately for you, this interaction has given me plenty to work with." Walker's face turned a shade paler, and he stepped back instinctively, his hand falling from his belt. The cracks in his confidence were now glaringly obvious. James took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them. "This isn't just about you and me," he continued. "It's about every person you've stopped under the same assumptions, every interaction where respect wasn't given, and every opportunity to build trust that you've squandered." "I didn't mean," Brian Walker began, but James Porter cut him off with a raised hand. "Don't," James said sharply. "Don't excuse it, don't justify it, and don't dismiss it. What you meant isn't the issue. What you did is." Walker's shoulders sagged slightly, his gaze dropping to the ground. The once confident officer now looked like a schoolboy caught in the act, struggling to find the right words to explain himself. James's tone softened, but his words retained their edge. "You wear that badge, Officer Walker, not as a symbol of power, but as a symbol of service. Service to the community, to the people, and to the values this department is supposed to stand for. Today, you failed to uphold those values." The silence stretched between them, heavy and unbroken, as Walker fumbled for something to say. I didn't realize who you were," he muttered finally, his voice almost inaudible. James shook his head, a faint trace of disappointment flashing in his eyes. "That's exactly the problem," he said. "You didn't take the time to find out who I was. You didn't care. You made assumptions, Officer Walker. Assumptions based on nothing more than your bias. And that's dangerous. For you, for this department, and for the people we're supposed to protect." Walker looked up, his expression a mixture of guilt and fear. "What happens now?" he asked hesitantly. James' gaze didn't waver. "What happens now is that this incident gets documented," he said. "There will be a formal review and you will answer for your actions. But this is about more than just one report. This is about creating a culture where this kind of behavior isn't just reprimanded, it's prevented." James reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "You'll be hearing from my office soon," he said, holding it out to Walker. "Until then, I suggest you take a good, hard look at yourself and decide what kind of officer you want to be." Walker hesitated before taking the card, his hand trembling slightly. James stepped back, the quiet authority in his stance leaving no room for further argument. He opened the door to his car and slid inside, starting the engine. Before driving away, he looked at Walker one last time. "Remember, Officer Walker." As James' car pulled onto the road and disappeared into the fading light, Walker remained rooted to the spot, the card clutched tightly in his hand. The events of the past half hour played over in his mind, each moment a glaring reminder of the choices he'd made and the consequences that would follow. For James, the drive home was quiet but reflective. He knew the road to change would be long and difficult, but moments like these were where it started. The fight for accountability and respect within law enforcement wasn't just a battle, it was a mission, and James Porter was determined to see it through. The early sunlight streaming through the blinds painted James' desk with streaks of gold, but his focus was entirely on the file in front of him. Brian Walker's record lay open, a mix of minor complaints, unaddressed infractions, and vague notes that hinted at deeper issues. It wasn't a record that screamed misconduct, but it whispered complacency, a symptom of a system that allowed small cracks to grow unchecked. James tapped his pen against the desk, his mind racing. Walker wasn't the root of the problem. He was a branch, a piece of a much larger tree that needed pruning. If the department had ignored Walker's behavior, how many others were operating under the same assumptions, unchecked and unchallenged? A knock at the door pulled James from his thoughts. Sophia Clark, his assistant, stepped in with a fresh stack of reports. "Morning, Mr. Porter," she said, placing the files on his desk. "Here's the latest misconduct summaries you requested. Also, Chief Robert Mitchell wanted me to remind you about the department-wide review next week." James nodded, picking up the top report. "Thanks, Sophia. Can you also schedule a meeting with Chief Mitchell for this afternoon? There's something I need to discuss with him." "Of course," she replied, her tone professional but curious. She lingered for a second, as if sensing the gravity of James's mood, before leaving the room quietly. James leaned back in his chair, flipping through the reports. Patterns emerged. Minor complaints swept under the rug, disciplinary actions avoided to maintain morale. It was a culture of avoiding confrontation, one that prioritized convenience over accountability. By the time the afternoon rolled around, James found himself sitting across from Chief Robert Mitchell in a conference room. Mitchell, a veteran officer with a grizzled demeanor, listened intently as James outlined the previous day's events and the larger systemic issues they represented. "This isn't just about Walker," James said, his voice steady but resolute. "It's about the environment that allows someone like Walker to operate this way, without fear of repercussions. If we don't address that, we're failing the people we're supposed to serve." Mitchell sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You're proposing a full review of the department," he said, more a statement than a question. "Yes," James confirmed. "Not just individual officers, but our training protocols, our accountability measures, and the way we handle complaints. We need to rebuild trust, starting from the inside out." "You know this won't be popular," Mitchell said, his tone cautious. James met his gaze. "I'm not here to win a popularity contest. I'm here to fix what's broken." The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. James launched the department-wide review, holding forums to hear directly from the community and meeting with officers to discuss their perspectives. Some embraced the change, while others resisted, clinging to the old ways. Walker, meanwhile, faced an internal hearing. James Porter made no effort to shield him, ensuring the process was transparent and fair. The hearing ended with a suspension, but for James the real victory lay in the conversations it sparked, about accountability, respect, and the true meaning of the Months later, James stood at a podium during a community event, addressing a room full of officers, city officials, and residents. He spoke of responsibility and the shared duty to uphold the principles of justice and fairness. "Change doesn't happen overnight," James said, his voice echoing through the hall. "But it starts with moments like this, when we choose to hold ourselves accountable and demand better from one another. That's how we build trust. That's how we serve with integrity." The applause was deafening, but James didn't dwell on it. For him, this was just the beginning. Change was never easy, but it was always worth the fight. As he stepped down from the podium, he felt a sense of purpose that reinforced why he had chosen this path. The work wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like the department was heading in the right direction. As James stepped off the podium, the energy in the room buzzed with an unspoken charge. Conversations sparked among officers, city officials, and residents alike. Some voices were raised in agreement, while others were hushed, steeped in contemplation. James paused near the back of the room, his eyes scanning the crowd. He wasn't looking for approval. He was looking for understanding, for the seeds of change to take root. Chief Robert Mitchell approached him, his expression thoughtful. "Do you know, James?" Mitchell began, his voice low. "I've been in this job long enough to see a lot of speeches come and go, but this one? It feels different." James offered a faint smile, his tone modest. "Words only mean something if they lead to action, Chief. We've got a long way to go." Mitchell nodded, placing a firm hand on James's shoulder. "And you're the right man to lead the way." The two men stood in silence for a moment, watching as groups formed across the room. Officers, both young and seasoned, exchanged ideas with community leaders. Residents shared personal stories of interactions with the police, some positive, many not. It wasn't a perfect scene, but it was a start, a moment of unity in a system that had long been fractured. The following weeks tested James's resolve. The department's internal review expanded, uncovering not just individual missteps, but systemic flaws in training and accountability. James pushed for immediate reforms, introducing mandatory bias training and establishing a civilian oversight board to review complaints against officers. These measures were met with resistance by some, but others embraced them as a necessary evolution. Officer Walker's suspension became a symbol within the department, a reminder that no one was above scrutiny. James, however, made it clear that the goal wasn't to vilify individuals, but to cultivate a culture of respect and fairness. "Accountability isn't punishment," he told a group of officers during a training session. "It's how we ensure we're worthy of the trust this badge represents." Outside the precinct, community forums became a regular occurrence. James attended every single one, listening as residents voiced their concerns and frustrations. Many of their stories echoed the dynamics of his encounter with Walker, moments where trust had been broken, where fear had replaced safety. But amid the criticism, there was hope. People wanted to believe in their police department again, and James was determined to give them a reason to. One evening, after a particularly long forum, a young woman approached James. "You probably don't remember me," she began hesitantly. "But a few years ago an officer treated my dad like he didn't matter. It was small maybe to them, but it wasn't small to us. Hearing you talk tonight." Her words stayed with James as he drove home that night. The fight for justice, he realized, wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping changes. It was about those small, meaningful moments where people felt seen, heard, and valued. Months turned into a year, and the department began to shift in noticeable ways. New recruits brought fresh energy and a commitment to the department's evolving values. Veteran officers who resisted change either adapted or moved on. The community's relationship with the police grew stronger, built on the foundations of transparency and mutual respect. On the anniversary of his encounter with Walker, James found himself at the same intersection where it had all begun. Tucked his car and stepped out, taking a moment to reflect. The streets bustled around him, but for James, the world felt quiet, still. This was where change had started, with one interaction, one choice to challenge the status quo. James knew there was still work to be done, but for the first time, he felt confident that they were on the right path. Change wasn't just possible, it was happening. And it all began with the decision to stand for what was right. The story of James's journey is a powerful reminder that change often starts with a single moment of courage and a commitment to integrity. In your life, whether you're facing challenges at work, in your community, or even within yourself, this story highlights the importance of standing firm in your values, even when it's difficult. Reflect on situations where you might feel frustrated or powerless, and ask yourself, what small actions can I take today to lead by example and inspire positive change? Like James, remember that progress doesn't happen overnight. It's built on consistent effort, accountability, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Engage in open conversations, challenge biases, and take responsibility for the spaces you influence. Your actions, no matter how small they seem, can set a standard and encourage others to rise to it. As you navigate your own path, let this story remind you that real impact comes not just from addressing the problems you see, but also from creating a culture of respect, fairness, and accountability that uplifts everyone around you. Change is a ripple effect. Your decision to start can inspire others to join.